Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications for Atlanta History Center, and I'm also the coordinator of the author talk series. Tonight, we're joined by historian John Ferling to discuss his newest book, Winning Independence, The Decisive Years of the Revolutionary War, 1778 to 1781. He'll be in conversation with Jim Sefcik. If you haven't already done so, we highly encourage you to purchase a copy of John's book from tonight's official bookseller and local independent bookstore, Acapella Books. A link to do that is in the chat. John will also be taking your questions this evening, so please use the Q&A feature to submit those, and him and Jim will get to as many as time allows with our program this evening. I will briefly introduce tonight's guests and then turn it over to them to begin the conversation. John is a professor emeritus of history at the University of West Georgia. He's the author of many books on the American Revolution, including these are just some of the many: The Ascent of George Washington, Whirlwind, a finalist for the 2015 Kirkus Book Prize, and most recently, prior to this newest book, Apostles of Revolution, Jefferson, Paine, Monroe, and the Struggle Against the Old Order in America and Europe. We are so excited to be welcoming him tonight. I was telling him earlier, this is actually the sixth time we've hosted him. So it's just absolutely a pleasure to have him back with us at Atlanta History Center for the first time virtually this evening. He and his wife, Carol, live near Atlanta. He will be in conversation with Jim Sefcik. Jim is the former director of the Louisiana State Museum. He also held management positions at the New York State Museum, the Chrysler Museum, and the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. He taught undergraduate and graduate courses on early America in Pennsylvania, New Orleans, and New York. He received his bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's University, Philadelphia, and his master's from Temple University. He has ABD from Notre Dame. We are so grateful that they're both joining us this evening. Jim, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you both again for being here tonight.
Thank you, Claire. John, it's good to see you again, as always. In reading your book, it becomes clear almost immediately that the Southern strategy is the key to understanding your book. So tell us what the Southern strategy is all about, and how and why did it evolve?
Okay, sure. Let me just say real quickly, I wanted to thank the Atlanta History Center and Claire for all that she has done in preparation for tonight's event. So it's an honor to be here, and also to thank Jim for taking the time to prepare questions and giving up his evening. He would have otherwise probably been watching the New York Yankees on TV or something. So I'm delighted to be back again at the Atlanta History Center, even if it's just virtually. Okay, the Southern strategy. What happened essentially was that at the outset of the war, Britain's strategy was to try to defeat Washington's army and to win control of as many northern colonies, they call them, we call them states, but to win back control of as many northern colonies as they could. And that was the strategy that Britain pursued from the beginning of the war at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 until the end of 1777. And the strategy failed. Failed egregiously, ending up with the surrender of General John Burgoyne's army at Saratoga in October of 1777. So once the news of Saratoga reached England, the ministry of Lord Frederick North had to make a decision of whether to stay in the war, because there was now a considerable amount of opposition. Many people thought it was not only a hopeless situation, but it seemed to be apparent that France was going to come into the war, and there were many who wanted to get out of the war before the French could get in. If the decision was made to remain in the war, then some sort of new strategy had to be devised. It was just unthinkable to continue doing further what had failed over the first 30 months of the war. So there's a long debate in Norse ministry that goes on through the early winter of 1778. And finally, the forces that wanted to stay in the war won that debate. And the person who is really the key figure in leading the fight to stay in the war was Lord George Germain. He holds the position of American Secretary or Secretary of State for the American Colonies. And that position, in effect, made him the minister of war, and he was responsible for the British Army in North America. And Germain thought that he conceived a strategy that he thought might net Great Britain something out of this war. America might still become independent. It might not be fully conquered, but that something could come out of it. And that something was the reacquisition of 2 or possibly 3 southern colonies that had departed in 1776. And those 3 were Georgia and South Carolina for sure. And Germain thought it was conceivable that if South Carolina was taken, North Carolina could be taken as well. And the reason that Germain thought that was a feasible strategy was that he believed, and I think quite correctly, that a larger percentage of Southerners remained loyal to Great Britain than was the case in the northern colonies. And given the fact that France was going to come into the war and that Britain's army would have to be reduced here to meet French challenges elsewhere, then those loyalists in Georgia and South Carolina would be vital to Britain's war effort. Germain foresaw some of these loyalists coming into the British Army and as regulars and serving in what became known as provincial regiments, while others would serve in loyalist militia units. And the idea was that the British Army in the South would drive the rebels out of an area, and then the loyalist militia would come in behind the army and take control of that area and pacify the area over the next few months. And gradually, 2 or maybe 3 colonies would come back into the fold. And if Germain's strategy worked out, then it was conceivable that at war's end, the United States might look something like this. The area that's shaded in the US would have been, the area shaded in red would have been the United States. And everything that is shown in white would be part of the British Empire. So you can see on this map, if the Southern strategy is viable, then Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina would be would return to the British Empire. The British already controlled East and West Florida, having won them from Spain in an earlier war. They still controlled the Trans-Appalachian West, and they still controlled Canada. So the United States would have been small. It would have been encircled by a huge major power, Great Britain, and it would face a rather bleak future. So that was how the Southern strategy came about, and essentially that was what Germain envisioned and was able to carry the cabinet on that decision.
And what about Sir Henry Clinton? What was his role in the development of the Southern strategy?
Okay, what Clinton really didn't have a role in putting the strategy together. Let me call up Clinton here and show everybody what he looked like. This is Sir Henry Clinton, and while he didn't have a role in putting together the Southern strategy, um, Germain had to choose a new commander-in-chief of the army in America in 1778 because the present commander-in-chief, General William Howe, had resigned after Saratoga, and Germain turned to Clinton, and in March of '78, he wrote to Clinton that he was now going to be elevated to be the commander of the army. And Clinton receives that note from Germain in May of 1778. So he's going to be in command from May of 1778 through the decisive engagement at Yorktown in the fall of 1781 and for a few months beyond that. And Clinton becomes one of the key figures in my book. He obviously plays a huge role in the 4 years after Saratoga. So let me say just a word or two about Clinton. He was 48 years old when he was named commander, 2 years older than George Washington was at the time. He came from an aristocratic background. His father had been a career naval officer who became the royal governor of New York, and Sir Henry was raised during a portion of his youth in New York City. And he opted for a military career as his father had, except that Clinton went in to the army. He joined when he was still a teenager, and he had fought in 2 wars before the Revolutionary War. In fact, he was seriously wounded in an engagement in Germany in the 7 Years' War in the early 1760s. Clinton was an intellectually curious individual. He read widely, read especially deeply on military history and military strategy and tactics, and even paid out of his own pocket in 1774 to make a trip deep into Eastern Europe to observe a war between Russia and the Turks, hoping to learn more about strategy and tactics. He was sent to America in 1775. He arrived just after Lexington and Concord, and just in time to see some action at Bunker Hill. And over the next 30 months, he served with some distinction, and he earned something of a reputation within the British Army as the best strategist among the higher ranking general officers in the British Army. So this is Clinton who's going to take command, and his orders were to implement the Southern strategy, among other things. And the other things included something that is important, and that is that Clinton was told in his initial orders that he had to relinquish 8,000 of his troops. They were mostly going to be sent to the Caribbean to deal with the French threat. So, in addition to not having the several thousand British troops that had been surrendered at Saratoga and were now prisoners of war, he had to cough up 8,000 of his troops. So he was going to have a considerably smaller army to command than had been in America 12 months before. And the result was that Clinton started his command on a pessimistic note. He said, "My fate is hard. as he wrote to a friend right after learning of his appointment, because he now concluded that it was probably inevitable that Britain would lose the war. And he was deeply worried that once it did lose the war, that he would be scapegoated for that defeat.
Then, in light of that, I was going to ask you about whether or not it made sense to reduce his army once they adopted the Southern strategy. But it seems to me that maybe the bigger question is, did Germain set up Clinton to fail in executing the Southern strategy? And if he did, why did he do that?
Well, I don't think he deliberately set him up to fail. I don't think Germain had very much choice in this, and I'm not a great defender of Germain. In fact, in many ways, Germain comes out of my book as kind of the villain of the piece, or at least one of the villains of the piece. But what was, now that France was coming into the war, and Spain's entrance into the war was anticipated, and it was another year before they came in, but the Spanish also came in to the war. Britain found itself engaged in a world war. It had to have troops in America, and those troops were scattered from Florida for fear that the Spanish would attempt, as they did, as a matter of fact, to regain Florida. They had to keep troops in Canada for fear that the French would try to regain Canada, which it had lost back in 1763. It had to keep troops in the Caribbean, where both France and Great Britain had a number of extremely valuable sugar islands, and it had to keep some troops in the home islands back in England, because there was a danger of an invasion by the French. And in fact, France and Spain jointly cooperated to attempt to invade England in 1779, though that turned out to be a failure and then didn't get very far. But Germain, of course, didn't have a crystal ball, and he knew he had to have British troops in all of these places. And so I don't think he had much choice but to reduce the army in America and then hope that the loyalists would be willing to bear arms for their king.
When Clinton finds out that the loyalists are not delivering the way everyone had hoped they would, what were his alternatives? Did he consider using African American troops? Did he freeing the slaves? Did he think about the Indians? Did he have options?
Well, I think Clinton's view toward the loyalists is interesting, because it's something of a roller coaster. At the beginning, Clinton felt that Germain was maybe not correct, that the loyalists would rush to bear arms. But Clinton sent an expedition to Georgia in December of 1778, about what would it be, 6 or 7 months after he took command. It was a 3,000-man expedition, and it succeeded in taking Savannah and destroying the American army that defended Savannah in a one-day engagement. And in the wake of that, Clinton became had developed a more positive attitude with regard to the loyalists, and he in the spring of 1780, Clinton sent an expedition to South Carolina. In fact, he personally led the expedition, a huge joint naval land expedition that conducted a siege operation at Charleston that resulted in the surrender of Charleston and of a 5,000-man American army that defended Charleston. This was really America's Saratoga, so to speak. And immediately after the surrender, large numbers of loyalists did rush to take up arms. So that Clinton, who had been skeptical to begin with, by the summer of 1780, had much more positive view about the loyalists as allies. But the problem that developed was that the British Army would go into an area, and once they abandoned that area, then the loyalists who were there and had helped them were just, in essence, left to hang out and dry. And after a couple of those incidents, for example, General Cornwallis, and let me show you a picture of Cornwallis after Clinton succeeded in taking, there we go. After Clinton succeeded in taking Charleston, he returned to New York and he appointed his second in command, General Charles Cornwallis, as the commander of the British Army in the South. So it was Cornwallis's job to complete the pacification of the backcountry in South Carolina and to attempt to recruit loyalists in North Carolina and make inroads there. And Cornwallis took an army up into North Carolina in September of 1780. But the end result of his incursion was Kings Mountain, a devastating loss where Cornwallis lost about a quarter of his men. And Cornwallis immediately withdrew his army back into South Carolina. And the poor loyalists who had joined with him, cooperated, were left to the mercy of the rebels in North Carolina. And Clinton soon came to think that there just would be a dearth of loyalists to take up arms. And so ultimately what this led to is in the fall of 1780, Clinton devised a new strategy for winning the war. Remember, as I had said earlier, the previous strategy was the British Army would drive the rebels out of an area and the loyalist militia would come in behind them and pacify the area. And that clearly wasn't going to work. So some new strategy was developed. And remember too, I said that Clinton had won a reputation as perhaps the best strategist in the British Army in America. So he put together a new strategy, and I think it was a viable strategy that might have led to the success of the Southern strategy if it had been given really a full opportunity to work. And this was Clinton's strategy. Clinton came to the conclusion that the resistance, rebel resistance down in the Carolinas was being sustained by supplies that came in from the north. And there were two forms of resistance in the South. One was rebel armies. Congress just kept sending one rebel army after another into the South, and one after another, those armies got defeated. In fact, in the 20-month period between December of 1778, when Savannah was taken, and the Battle of Camden in South Carolina in August of 1784, rebel armies were defeated, and more than 8,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. And the other form of resistance that developed in the summer of 1780 was a partisan war. Many of the people here probably saw Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, a few years ago that dealt with the partisan war. And you've heard of Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens and other partisans. So Clinton came to the conclusion that the only way the partisans could continue to function, or any rebel army could continue to function, was through supplies that were funneled in from up north. And basically what happened was the United States was acquiring, in one way or another, munitions and arms from abroad. And those items mostly came in through New England ports. And then they flowed south down through Philadelphia and Maryland and Delaware and into Virginia, through Virginia, into North Carolina, down through North Carolina, chiefly through Charlotte, and then on into South Carolina and Georgia. So Clinton's strategy was to put an army for the first time, a British army for the first time, into Virginia. And he, in December of 1780, just a couple of months after Kings Mountain, he commits an army to Virginia that is commanded by his newfound general Benedict Arnold. This is just a few weeks after Arnold had turned coat. It was a relatively small army, only about 1,800 men. And Clinton thought in short order that it was such a small army that it was vulnerable. And so he sent in a much larger army under General William Phillips. And Phillips is sent in March of 1781, and then he sends reinforcements to Phillips, so that ultimately there's about 6,000 British troops in Virginia. And their job was, number one, to destroy rebel supply depots in Virginia. Number two, to try to interdict the flow of supplies into the Carolinas. And in addition to that, Clinton was convinced that the very presence of a British army in Virginia would require Virginia's governor, who happened to be Thomas Jefferson at this point, to keep his militia at home. So this is step one in his new strategy. Step two was that Cornwallis was to remain in South Carolina. And now, without Virginia militia there, with the source of supplies for the partisans and rebel armies drying up, Clinton reasoned that Cornwallis should have a pretty easy go in snuffing out the insurgency in Georgia and South Carolina and possibly North Carolina. So that's the strategy that he puts together to try to implement Germain's Southern strategy.
What can you tell us? Well, let's put it this way: was the use of loyalists undermined by the attitude of the British soldiers, not Clinton, but the officers below them? Was there antipathy between the two? Did that hurt matters? Is there any evidence of that?
Not so much that, I don't think, but I think what did happen was that the people in South Carolina and Georgia just bridled at the presence of the British Army. And I mean, this was a tough war. It was a civil war that was going on. And the partisans were utilizing terroristic tactics. And even though Cornwallis and Clinton admonished their troops to don't act in kind, if you do, you're going to turn people against us. But out in the field, human nature being what it was, the individual British soldiers committed reprisals and whatever. And over and over again, I think people who joined who were active in the militia, rebel militia, or went into the Continental Army, or especially into the partisan movement, said, look, what drove me to that step was what the British soldiers were were doing to us, the acts that they were committing. And I think that just was like fuel for the partisans. Certainly the partisan force was instrumental in what was going on in the war in the South. And in fact, one of the things I mentioned in the book as a sidelight was that at the end of the war, General Washington delivered two farewell addresses. I think we're more familiar with his farewell address as president of the United States, but at war's end, he delivered two farewell addresses. One he delivered at West Point to his soldiers, and the other one was before Congress a few weeks later in Annapolis when he surrendered his commission. And in both of those farewell addresses, Washington talked about those who had contributed to the American victory. And he never mentions France in either of those addresses. Now, that was probably for reasons of state, but he never said a word about the partisans either. And I'm not sure why that was the case. It may have been. I mean, Washington really didn't have any experience in the war in the South. He never came south until September of 1781, and that was for the Yorktown campaign. And he was out of there and back up in Philadelphia a few weeks later. So I think maybe he wasn't really fully aware of what was going on, or maybe he just didn't want to ennoble partisan warfare.
Speaking of partisan warfare, what can you tell us about Tarleton?
Well, Tarleton was Banastre Tarleton was a commander of what was called the British Legion, and it had been formed before the Southern strategy was put together. In fact, most of the men who enlisted in the British Legion, which was a cavalry unit with some infantry as well, most of the men who had enlisted were from Pennsylvania or nearby Pennsylvania. And Tarleton himself wasn't. Tarleton was from England, and he had studied at Oxford, but didn't linger there very long, and then went into the British Army and came over to America fairly early in the war. And he plays an important role as a cavalry officer for the British, an important role first in the siege of Boston, siege of Charleston, in closing exit routes from Charleston, so that Benjamin Lincoln's army was sealed there and eventually had to surrender. But soon after Charleston, there were still some rebel units in South Carolina. And one unit was a unit of regulars from Virginia that had come down to South Carolina, but couldn't get into Charleston. They arrived too late to get in, and the exits were sealed off by them. And so Cornwallis and Clinton, this was just before Clinton left, sent Tarleton off to look for those Virginians. And they found them up in what were called the Waxhaws, up near in northern South Carolina, up near the North Carolina border. And an engagement took place. And even Tarleton used the term massacre in describing what happened. Buford's men, the Virginians, were just overrun and many of them were killed out of hand, I think, in the aftermath of the fighting. It remains sort of a controversial matter as to whether Tarleton ordered the massacre or not. I don't think he did. In fact, he launched a cavalry charge against Buford's men, and Tarleton's horse was shot from under him and fell on him, and so he's being extricated from underneath the horse while his men are going on the rampage. But it becomes a crucial matter in the South because for the rest of the war, because the conventions in 18th century warfare was once a battle was over and those people who wanted surrender called for quarter, as it was called, then they were spared. They laid down their arms, they were taken captives, then they weren't massacred. But that didn't happen in the Waxhaws, and so Southerners talked from that point on about Tarleton's quarter, and on more than one occasion, at Kings Mountain, for example, at Cowpens again, when the British when British forces were routed, rebels shouting Tarleton's quarter exacted their revenge on their prisoners.
What was I going to ask you there? Oh, what can you tell us about the personal relationship between Clinton and Cornwallis?
Yeah, it's kind of an up and down relationship. In fact, I'm working on an article on that matter right now. The two, there was about 8 years difference between the two men. Clinton was the older of the two, but they had both served in Germany during the 7 Years' War. They got to know one another, and they had a friendly relationship during that time. And then they're reunited in America. Clinton comes over in 75, and Cornwallis arrives a year later. And again, it was a cordial relationship. They're both serving under General William Howe. And during the New York campaign, Clinton became exasperated with Howe, and he aired his grievances in a private conversation with Cornwallis, and Cornwallis went to General Howe and tattled on Clinton, and Clinton would not forgive him for that. He broke off his ties with Cornwallis. But then intermediaries got involved and tried to bring the two together. And Cornwallis eventually served under Clinton again, including in Charleston. And for a time they had a good relationship, but it was, in a sense, it was dicey from the very beginning, because Clinton had written to Germain. He was frustrated with the situation in America and with Germain's intrusiveness, and he asked permission to resign and return home. And if Germain agreed and Clinton went home, then his number two man, who happened to be Cornwallis, would succeed him and become commander of the British Army. So when they went to Charleston, everybody in the British Army seemed to, I mean, they knew that Clinton wanted out, and everybody seemed to think that London would agree and Clinton would soon be gone and Cornwallis would replace him. And it didn't happen. In fact, months dragged by before a decision was finally made. And just about the time the siege of Charleston was going to begin, word came from Germain that the king and Germain had denied Clinton's request that he be permitted to resign. And Cornwallis seemed to turn on a dime at that point. He told Clinton, all right, don't consult me on any other matter. I don't want to be involved in it. And Clinton thought this was, and he was right. I think this was just thoroughly unprofessional on Cornwallis's part. And from that point on, their relationship really went downhill. And after Yorktown, it goes downhill further. And there's a long sort of war between Clinton and Cornwallis after the war, in which they exchanged pamphlets and recriminations against one another for who was responsible for the defeat at Yorktown.
What do you think? Do you think Germain deserves the most blame for losing America?
I certainly think he deserves blame for it. And the paramount reason for me saying that is that I mentioned earlier on that Clinton had put an army of about 6,000 men under General Phillips in Virginia in March of 1781. But Clinton never intended that army to remain in Virginia permanently. Clinton went into 1781 absolutely convinced that this was going to be the last year of the war. And he wasn't alone in that. I think Washington felt the same way. If you read the letters of Marquis de Lafayette, I think he's saying the same thing. And the reason for thinking that this was going to be the last year of the war was twofold. On the one hand, America's economy had absolutely collapsed, and with it, American morale was beginning to sag. By the time you get to 1781, they're in the fourth year since Saratoga, and the Americans haven't won a single substantive victory. The French have been over here for about 3 years, and they haven't won a single victory of any kind. And so the feeling on the one hand was that America just could not continue beyond 1781. And the second thing I think that led Clinton and others to think that 1781 was going to be the last year of the war was that there was now considerable evidence, probably circumstantial to be sure, but nevertheless some evidence that the ardor for remaining in the war was evaporating in France. As I said, the French had been in the war for a long time and had accomplished nothing. They were running themselves deeply into debt, which would have real reverberations for them down the road, leading to the French Revolution. But and so the feeling was that the Allies, America and France, would have to launch a campaign of some sort in 1781 to score a decisive victory. And if that didn't happen, France would probably take a face-saving route. A lot of European neutral countries were calling for an end to the war. Their trade was being harmed by the continuation of the war. And France would take a face-saving way out of the war by agreeing to a peace conference in Europe that would result in a negotiated settlement. And who knows what would happen in that settlement? Maybe American independence would be recognized, but then again, maybe it wouldn't, because a lot of the countries that would be at that peace conference would be monarchical states. And so Clinton figured that there would be there would be a major Allied campaign someplace in 1781. It could be in the Chesapeake, or it could be in New York. And Clinton felt through British intelligence that it would probably most likely, almost certainly, in fact, he used the term certainly, it would be in against New York. That would be a far bigger prize. So from the beginning, Clinton planned to extricate all but 2,000 of the troops in Virginia and pull them back to New York to increase his army to withstand the Allied attack that was likely to occur in the late summer or early fall. And he began to put that into operation in June. He calls for the removal of the first 3,000 of those 6,000 troops in New York. And they are in the process of boarding transports in Portsmouth, Virginia, to sail to New York when Clinton reverses himself and he sends down orders countermanding his earlier orders and says, okay, keep the troops in Virginia and put them in a defensive position that whatever it happens to be, probably Yorktown. And the reason Clinton reversed himself was that between the two orders that he issued, he received an order from Lord Germain. And Germain said, neither I nor the king want you to remove a single soldier from Virginia. And so the result was that a British army, Cornwallis, had abandoned the South Carolina by then and marched into Virginia. So there were now about 7,500 British troops in Virginia. So instead of 2,000 men in Virginia, there were 7,500 British troops there. And it raises an interesting question. And I can't answer the question, but the question is, what if only 2,000 troops had been in Virginia? Would the Allies have thought that was a big enough prize to go after? Could that have brought an end to the war? And if not, then they would have had to attack New York. And what would have happened if they would have attacked New York? And again, I can't answer that. I can only say that the British had occupied New York for 5 years, and they had been working on their defenses in New York all that time. It would have been a very tough go for the Allies to either win through an attack or a siege in New York. And everything that Rochambeau seems to tell Washington when they discussed their options during the spring and early summer was that an attack on New York probably could not succeed. So Rochambeau was really the one that first envisaged the idea of an attack in Virginia. He didn't, and when he made that decision or recommended that choice, he didn't know that Cornwallis was there yet. And Washington was opposed to it for a very long time. Washington kept insisting on attacking New York. But finally, I think after they learned that Cornwallis is there, they learned that 7,500 men are there. Washington is persuaded, and Yorktown will be the target, and that's where, as it turns out, the decisive battle is going to be fought in 1781. Just as Clinton knew it was going to be fought somewhere, he just didn't know where.
Thanks, John. I think Claire wants to open it up now to questions from the audience. Claire?
Yeah, so we have a lot of great questions in the Q&A. So I'll just start from the top, start with the first one. This is from an anonymous attendee. How did freeing American slaves figure into the British Southern strategy? And what role did loyalist and patriot blacks play in the Southern campaign?
Sure. That's an important question. And General Clinton, as the war went along in the South, issued what became known as the Phillipsburg Proclamation. And in that proclamation, he offered freedom to the slaves that were owned by rebels who would flee behind British lines. And Clinton envisaged most of those slaves serving as a labor force. They would grow crops for the British troops. So we hear a lot about the shortages that the American army faced throughout the war, which was certainly true, but the British army faced shortages too. So those freedmen would grow crops for the British army. Some would serve as scouts for the British army. They would play multifaceted roles, and some would actually bear arms. Clinton did form a couple of units that were composed of former slaves, and he didn't have the authority to decide what would happen to them following the war. But Clinton did say in 1780, if it is up to me, once the war comes to an end and we regain these southern colonies, these people will be given land in the former in the colonies that had been returned. That, of course, didn't pan out because the Southern strategy didn't pan out. On the other hand, on the American side, when Washington arrived in Boston to take command of the Continental Army in July of 1775, he discovered some African Americans already there and serving in the Continental Army. And these were men who were from New England colonies, and they had been part of their militia unit, and then they went into the Continental Army. And Washington he was a slave owner. He ultimately owned about 300 slaves, and he was horrified by what he saw. He thought it would for an abundance of reasons. In part, I think Washington thought, look, we have to recruit an army from 13 states, and it's not going to help recruit white soldiers from places like Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia and North Carolina if they have to serve with black soldiers. And so Washington went to Congress and asked Congress if he could kick all of the black soldiers out of the Continental Army. And Congress said, no, you can't. They can stay in as long as they wish, but Congress prohibited the recruitment of black soldiers thereafter. Now, this was in 1775. But as the war drags on and it becomes more and more difficult, and in 1778, some of the colonies, particularly New England colonies, just disobeyed Congress, and they began to recruit African Americans. So in the end, at the end of the war, there's about 100,000. We know that about 100,000 men served in the Continental Army during the war. And the best estimate is that about 10% of those 100,000 were African American soldiers. John Lawrence, who was an aide de camp to Washington, he was from South Carolina. His father, Henry Lawrence, had been president of the Continental Congress for a good while, wanted to raise a large army of African Americans, men who were enslaved but were willing to bear arms for the United States in return for their freedom. And he ran into political opposition in South Carolina to doing that. And the only way that it would have been possible to pull it off would have been with Washington's support. I don't know whether even that would have turned the tide, but Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton, who was his close friend, both beseeched Washington to go to bat and try to persuade South Carolina to enlist African American soldiers, or slaves rather, and Washington refused to do that. And so in the end, I mean, you think about, we mentioned, I'm giving a long answer here, but the by 1780, there actually are more Americans serving in the British Army than in the Continental Army. And so the fact that 10% of those who are serving, who served in the Continental Army, were African Americans is an important figure. And I think they played a substantive role in the Continental Army.
And Barbara wants to know if you can speak a little bit about the role of Haitian troops in places like Savannah, which recently erected a monument to honor Haitians who fought in the American Revolution. So can you talk a little bit about the role of Haitian troops?
Of Haitian troops?
Yes, that's the
Yeah,
question.
well, I don't know very much about it, to be honest, but I know that when Comte d'Estaing brought his navy for a second time to North America in 1779 and conducted both a siege and an attack at Savannah, his army, and it was the first time that this was true of a French military force, included Haitian troops. They had been recruited in the Caribbean after France came into the war in 1778, and they fought in Savannah, and then d'Estaing went home, and I'm not absolutely sure. As far as I know, there were no more Haitian troops serving in America beyond that, but I wouldn't swear to that. I'm not absolutely sure about that.
Thank you. So I think we have time for about one or two more questions. So this is from Keith. And he says, could you please talk more about what was going on in the other British and French colonies during the Revolutionary years that you're describing? I think you touched on this a little bit, talking about why the British Army had to be dispersed so broadly across all of its different territories. But we hear a lot about Canada, Keith says, but we don't hear so much about the other British and French colonies during this time.
Right. Well, there are actually several books out on the war in the Caribbean. Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy at the University of Virginia has a book on on the West Indies during the Revolutionary War that would be worth taking a look at. And there was certainly a great deal of fighting in the West Indies. Much of it was naval action, but these were valuable colonies. There were great fortunes that had been made in France and in England off of the sugar trade and other commodities, coffee and chocolate and other commodities that came out of the Caribbean, and certainly off of the slave trade that both France and England were involved in. And so there was great pressure in both France and in England to hold on to the colonies that each possessed and to try to win more. And there was some fighting in Africa, and there was also some fighting in Asia, where Britain and France had already begun to establish a toehold as well.
I think our last question this evening, Art Douglas is curious, what is your evaluation of General Nathaniel Greene's performance in the Southern Theater?
Well, it's just a glowing appraisal. I devote a couple of chapters in the book to Greene's command in the South. He arrives in December of 1780 and takes command, and it's his army, or a portion of his army, he wasn't personally present, that defeated the British at Cowpens in January of 1780, and he was very much present and commanding against Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse, and in March of 1781, and then once Cornwallis abandoned South Carolina, Greene just had an open field. In fact, I entitle my chapter on that in the book Cornwallis's Gift, because Greene just retook virtually everything that the British had taken after the fall of Charleston. So I can't say enough good things about Nathaniel Greene's command. Had I known that I was going to get a question of that, I would have put a picture of me standing in front of the monument to Greene down in Savannah that had taken a couple of years ago.
Well, thank you so much, John. I think that's about all we have time for this evening. There's a few questions we didn't get to, and I apologize to those folks, but not to worry, because you can just buy a copy of John's book and find the answer to all of your questions and more. So it's available from Acapella Books or wherever you get your books, but we highly encourage you to support your local independent bookstore. I put a link to do that in the chat. So Jim and John, thank you both so much for being here tonight with us virtually. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thank everybody who attended tonight. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Enjoyed it.
Of course.
Always good to see you, John.
Night, Jim.
Night.
Well, if you're looking for more virtual author talks, you can find those at atlantahistorycenter.com. Tomorrow night, we're going to be welcoming Jem Lapidus, who's going to be talking about her book, Southern Ground. It's a combination history book and cookbook about the role of stone milled flour in the South. Really great. And next week, we're going to be having fiction author Colleen Oakley, Atlanta native, and she will be in conversation with fellow author Jill Santopolo. So you can find all of that and more at atlantahistorycenter.com. There's registration information there. Most of our talks are free, so we hope to see you at one very soon. Again, Jim and John, thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience tonight, and I hope everyone has a wonderful and safe evening.
Okay,
Good night.
Good night, everybody.